Welcome to Migdal Dialogues, a podcast from Yeshivat Migdal Torah. My name is Jonathan Ziring. I'm a Rabbi at Yeshivat Migdal Torah, and I'm here with...
I'm Rabbi Ben Aaronson, also a Rabbi at Migdal Torah.
I'm very excited to talk with Rabbi Aaronson. Besides for teaching with us at Yeshiva an afternoon and night seder, Rabbi Aaronson also holds a PhD in psychology and teaches psychology courses at the graduate and undergraduate level. And Rabbi Aaronson is going to be sharing some ideas about Torah and his other expertise, psychology. Can you please just introduce yourself a little bit and explain the type of questions that you find interesting before we begin our conversation?
Yeah, thanks so much, John. So I generally have kept my psychology and Torah separate. I think they both have their own disciplines. And at the same time, there's certainly a lot of my experience studying psychology, which has had an impact on my Torah worldview. And that's really what I'd like to focus a bit upon today, is how the field and science of psychology has an impact on learning Torah and keeping Torah.
Let's divide that into two. You said learning Torah and what was the other one? Living Torah?
Living Torah, keeping Torah, all the above.
Okay, so let's start with the first one. How has your studies in psychology and your experience as a psychologist, how has that affected the way you learn Torah? And how might it affect other people, maybe who are not experts, but have an interest in psychology? How might that affect their learning of Torah?
Okay, so I think the best way to start would be with an Ibn Ezra. So there's an Ibn Ezra in his commentary on the Torah and Shemot, and he discusses a little bit about the objectives of Torah and mitzvot. And in that context, he makes a very interesting comment. So he says, V'kadmonenu amru rachmana li babai. So that'll be familiar. He says the God desires the heart. But then as he continues, he says, V'shoresh kol ha-mitzvot ad sheyehav Hashem b'chol nafsho v'yidbak bo v'zeh lo yiyeh shalem im lo yakir ma'aseh Hashem be'elyonim uv'shvelim. So he says the foundation of all mitzvot are that we should love God with all our heart and cleave to Him. And this is not complete if we are not able to recognize Hashem in, I guess, above and below. Then here's the key comment. V'lo yuchal ladad Hashem im lo yada nafsho v'nishmato v'gufato. It's not really possible to know Hashem if you don't know your own soul, your own, I guess, body, and your neshama. So we can talk about differentiating those terms a little bit, but he's expressing that a person has to have a significant degree of self-knowledge in order to pursue the mitzvah of Yidiyas Hashem. And he continues, he says, Kol mi shelo yada mahus nafsho chachma malo. If a person doesn't know his own essence, his own soul, what benefit will Chachma be for him? So again, I think here the Ibn Ezra is pointing to this fact that in order to pursue the fundamental aspects of Torah, we need to have a certain degree of self-knowledge. And I believe psychology is a method through which we are able to get this foundational degree of self-knowledge.
That's really interesting. Let me just push you on that. So what is it about self-knowledge that's required to understand Torah? I'll show it to you later, but there's a piece in the Shirei Dat by Rav Blach, who I think was the Mashgiach at Telz, where he argues something similar to what you're saying, right? He says that the way you study Torah is that there's three factors in play. There's how you understand Torah, how you understand yourself, and how you understand the world. And as you deepen your understanding of each of those three prongs, you can gain a deeper understanding of the other prongs, right? That they work together. You know, intuitively, I sort of understand that, but what is it that you think that really means? And what do you think that psychology or the formal study of psychology adds that couldn't be accomplished, let's say, by introspection or something like that?
So the piece that you mentioned sounds fascinating, and I think it's very consistent with the Ibn Ezra, given the context that he makes this statement in is approaching Yidiyas Hashem and talking about the foundational aspects of mitzvot and, complete pursuit of Yidiyas Hashem. So I think psychology, just like other general disciplines, use a terminology and language that help us understand aspects of Torah. I wouldn't be surprised if a certain individual with the right types of introspection could learn a lot about their own personal psychology, and another observant individual could learn a lot about the psychology of the world. But in our modern scientific disciplines, there's lots going on in the scientific community that's looking at different aspects of the psychology of human beings, and I think that information does have a benefit both in terms of self-knowledge and in terms of understanding the world around us, the social world and the world of human beings. So as such, learning about the Elyonim and the Shvelim, right, the world at large, I think psychology plays a role in helping us understand the world around us.
So I definitely don't have the expertise you do in psychology, but I do read psychology sort of as an autodidact, and it definitely contributes to my understanding of the world and of Torah. But maybe it'd be helpful, it'll definitely be helpful for me, and I would assume for our listeners as well, if you could give me a concrete example. Like, is there a piece of Torah that you understand better because you are a psychologist?
So one example that comes to mind, John, is the probably well-known Gemara in Gittin, where we hear about King Shlomo's interaction with the king of the demons. So in that Gemara, without going into every detail, there are many, many psychological insights, and you can see one of the outcomes of reading through that Gemara gives you insights into how to navigate, I think, one's own psychology and to understand the psychology of human beings in general. So while I don't know that I would take the Gemara and use it to treat addiction directly, the psychological categories that it is referencing and discussing, I think the study of psychology has helped me give more modern terminology to understanding and interpreting that Gemara, for example.
So I think we'll have to sit down and learn that Gemara together. Rabbi Rabinovich, the late Rosh Hashiva of Yeshivat Birkat Moshe and Ma'ale Adumim, actually does have an extensive article about that Agadah, where he analyzes how Shlomo's escapades with the demon are better understood as his speaking to himself and the demons within himself, which is, I think, what you're getting at, that psychology can give us terms to what we would call those demons within himself and explain the dialogue that Shlomo is having. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that's one example. And again, we're just touching the surface there. Another area where I think it's fairly obvious is when it comes to tshuva. Every time during the year as I'm going through the tshuva process around
sorry to interrupt. You say tshuva, is it about learning Torah or is it about living Torah?
So, John, I think it is a little bit tricky to differentiate sometimes between the intellectual aspects of Judaism and what we might call the living aspects or performative aspects, because I do believe, and you probably agree with me here, that those two are intertwined to an extent. I do think the study of psychology has an impact in each. So one example in the intellectual sphere is Sadigon in his introduction talks about the different approaches of the wise versus the foolish person. And he explains that the wise person really builds his understanding of the world around him by observing the world, whereas the foolish person really assumes that reality is patterned after their own beliefs. And I think part of the study of psychology and that self-awareness helps us to interpret reality properly. And again, I think that's what the Ibn Ezra is getting at as well. That's one aspect on the intellectual side. On the side of personal development, Rabbeinu Yonah, in his introduction to Mishlei, it's his commentary on the second pasuk, which is his explanation of what the book is about, talks about the need to correct one's own character traits, and that sometimes we have to start with those negative character traits and iron those out in order to develop towards the character traits of the tzaddik. So in other words, if we don't deal with those negative character traits, they have the potential to distort our thinking and distort our actions. So once again, I think the study of psychology and self-awareness can have an impact across different areas.
Let me challenge you to give me a concrete example. So when I was living in Toronto, one of the rabbis in the community, Rabbi Chaim Strachler, who was then at Shari Shamayim, now he has moved to Teaneck, every year on Shabbat Shuvah, instead of giving a classic Shabbat Shuvah drasha, he basically argued what you did, which was psychology can help us understand ourselves and help us change. And so instead of giving a drasha on the importance of tshuva, he basically gave a psychology lecture, drawing insights from people like Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman and the like, on what we've learned about human nature and what insights we can take to help us practically actually change who we are in honor of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, the Aseret Yemei Tshuva. So that seems to be the type of thing you're suggesting you can do. So if you could pick one insight from modern psychology and tell me how it would practically help me, let's say, do tshuva, what would that insight be? And what would it look like to incorporate that psychological insight into a practical path forward in changing who I am?
Okay, that's a great question. One psychological theory that comes to mind has to do with how we understand the different conflicts and tensions within a person. And here again, I think many of these ideas do span across philosophy and psychology. We can talk about the difference between those disciplines another time. But one modern psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, comes up with an analogy that he thinks better fits the struggles that we have within human beings than perhaps more classical models. And that one in particular is the famous one of the rider and elephant, right? And so in this context, he describes, and I can quote directly from his 2012 book called The Happiness Hypothesis. He says, the mind is divided into parts that
Definitely
sometimes...
his less famous book.
Less famous, but I think
famous.
equally worth reading sometimes. He says, the mind is divided into parts that sometimes conflict. Like a rider on the back of an elephant, the conscious reasoning part of the mind has only limited control of what the elephant does. So here, there are a lot of different attempts that try to outline how we experience those different forces. But what this kind of highlights is that we're sometimes in a lot less control of our personalities than we think. And so there are other psychological books about willpower, understanding that willpower is a finite resource. It's not always the smartest approach when trying to make change to go directly against your personality. And I think what this analogy helps us highlight is we sort of have to coax our personality into going in some directions, working with some of the psychological parameters that exist already on the ground. Each of us are born with different personalities. And as such, we have to be sometimes smarter, working smarter and not harder when we are trying to make changes in our own personality. That's one example.
So let me see if I got this straight. So what you're saying is that much of the discussion, let's say around tshuva, talks about how do you strengthen your free will? How do you, let's say in the Gemara, how do you crush your Yetzer Hara with, I don't know, Shema or Talmud Torah or remembering the day of death? And what you're saying is that based on Haidt, one of the best ways to change is not to try to overpower your negative desires, but is to understand your desires and then positively try to get, based on your own nature, get yourself to do what you think is right anyways. And that insight would shift away from, let's say, the Musser approach where we scream and yell at ourselves, right, and rather get ourselves to do what we already want to do. Is something like that?
Yeah, I think it also speaks a little differently than what one might consider as the traditional rational approach, which I think if we get an idea clear to our mind, generally it can have an effect on us. But if it's an area that we have a conflict already, simply thinking about the rational idea and going through the rational steps doesn't always result in behavioral change right away. Clarifying those ideas are great, but understanding there's what our mind might see and what other parts of us might not yet see, understanding that tension and kind of intelligently handling our own personality is something that I think we can glean from modern psychology.
Got it. So, but now I think what you're saying is actually more novel. Is you're not just saying that insights from psychology can help us change who we are, but it's more than that. There's a whole group of, let's say, serious Jewish thinkers, the rationalists, who think that the proper way to deal with our Yetzer Hara, with our evil inclination, is simply to say, well, the Yetzer Hara is our emotions, is our passions, and the Yetzer Tov, the good inclination, is our intellect. So all we needed to do is make sure that we think more clearly than we feel or something like that, and that's enough. And what you're saying is that modern psychology has given you a reason to, I don't know if reject is too strong of a word, but to suggest a hard alternative to, let's say, the way the Rambam would conceptualize of tshuva, right? Of not your intellect overpowering your emotions, but actually of embracing the emotions and channeling them properly, which is a really different way of thinking. Implicit in that is that you think that it's possible for us to change who we really are. Is that something you think that the Torah believes? I mean, I would think that the Torah believes it, but does the Torah really think we can change who we are? And if so, like, how do you think that we do that, both from a Torah perspective and from a psychological perspective?
Yeah, that's an interesting observation and an interesting question. I do think that there are thinkers within Torah that do take a slightly more behavior-oriented approach and talk about, for example, how mitzvot can change who we are. One example that comes to mind is the Sefer HaChinuch on Etzem Lo Tishbru Bo, which is about the prohibition of breaking a bone within the Korban Pesach. And the Sefer HaChinuch raises this question of why do we need so many mitzvot around the mitzvah of Pesach, of Korban Pesach in particular. And in that context, he makes an interesting comment. He says, "And now, my son, if you have understanding, incline your ear and hear, and I will teach you to benefit from Torah and the commandments. You must know that man is acted upon according to his actions, and his heart and all his thoughts always follow after the actions that he does, whether good or bad." So he continues and says, even if a person's a Russia, nonetheless, mitzvot over time can have an impact on a person. So what he's explaining is that the experience and performance of mitzvot do have the power to change who a person is over time, and that performance does have an impact. It's an observation, and the Sefer Chinuch is not an anti-rationalist by any means. Nechama Leibowitz discusses this in particular as well, and reemphasizes this point that this is a statement about the nature of mitzvot and their impact on psychology in particular.
There are theories that in order to change who you are, right, you need to get into your subconscious, figure out what you're really thinking, change your mind, and then you can change who you are. So what you're telling me is that the psychological insights that are anticipated by the Sefer HaChinuch are offering a different path forward. It reminds me, and tell me what you think about this, but in Rabbi Yoni Rosenzweig's new book on mental health and halacha, he notes that while halachic authorities were often hesitant to deal with, let's say, Freudian psychology, which tried to get into what the person really thinks, because that often got into things that were anti-Torah or were presumed to be anti-Torah, they're much more comfortable with cognitive behavioral therapy and that type of psychology, which, as you said, focuses on the effects of our actions on who we are, simply because in sources like the Sefer HaChinuch, the idea that even without getting into our subconscious, we can change who we are through mitzvot, and therefore we can celebrate the role of mitzvot and its psychological impact. That's something that poskim can deal with a lot more easily because it actually fits into a framework of Torah. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think I'm glad you brought up cognitive behavioral therapy in particular, because it is a combination of both a cognitive perspective and a behavioral perspective. And just to give a quick background on those two areas, historically there was a branch of psychology that just focused on objective behavior, what's observable, and said, hey, there's nothing scientific that we can do with what's going on inside a person's mind. The other branch of psychology really focused on getting down deep into a person's thoughts and feelings, and that's where they wanted the field of psychology to go. They were at loggerheads for a time period. Now, X number of years later, probably 100 years plus from the foundations of the science of psychology, cognitive behavioral therapy is an integration of both perspectives, recognizing that how we act does have an influence on how we feel, and at the same time, introspection, understanding of our own personalities, and our thinking process both are relevant to treatment. And I would say similarly for our own personal development, I think there are many areas where that rational approach of thinking through something clearly is the best way to have a change, and that really dictates what our philosophy is and carries through to our actions. In areas where we're struggling, sometimes it's that behavioral approach or a combination of both, straightening out our behavior and our thoughts, that can have an impact and be most efficient and successful in helping us develop as human beings.
Let me just pick up on something that you said. Right? You said that on the one hand, in certain areas you think that the right thing to do is to follow the approach where we just try to analyze what are we thinking, change our thoughts, but where we're struggling, we should use a more behavioral approach and say the mitzvot can change who we are. Let's focus on what we do, and hopefully our psychology will follow, which sounds like the choice to follow behavior is personal, right? In a case where I'm struggling, I should find the actions and the mitzvah that change who I am. But the chinuch that you quoted, right, says that the reason we have so many mitzvot around Karban Pesach is because the mitzvot change who we are, but everyone's doing the same mitzvot. So, that might imply not like what you're saying, that we should use actions to address our personal problems, but really, if I follow the 613 mitzvot, and we're all following the same 613 mitzvot, and that has effect on action, so then we'll all be great people because he'll mold us in the same way. So which one do you think it is? Do you think that mitzvot shape who we are in the same way? Or are you saying that, no, the choice to use mitzvot to change who we are, and the way we do that is actually personal?
Right. That's a great question. The end of that Sefer Chinuch quotes a Mishnah at the end of Makos, which is quite familiar to us. It comes up very often in our tefillot. Rabbi Chananya ben Akasha meratzah kadosh baruch hu zakodet Yisrael lefikach hirba lahem Torah u'mitzvot shnei amar Hashem chafetz l'man tzidko yagdil Torah ve'adir. Right. So loosely translated, Rabbi Chananya ben Akasha says, the Holy One, blessed be He, sought to confer merit upon the Jewish people. Therefore, He increased for them Torah and mitzvot. As it says in Yeshaya, it pleased Hashem for the sake of his righteousness to make the Torah great and glorious.
The Mishnah that leads into Kaddish and has saved many an endless drasha.
Yes,
that didn't
exactly.
know how to just end. Yeah, okay.
Precisely. So funny, we repeat that all the time, but we don't always think about what that means. So the Rambam, in his commentary on that Mishnah, makes a very interesting comment. And I've actually seen this mistranslated in some places. But what the Rambam explains is the reason we have so many mitzvot is not necessarily just in a quantitative way that we just have a ton so we can get our score sheet up, the score up as high as possible. But what he explains is that the variety of mitzvot that one has the opportunity to perform in their lifetime creates space where an individual can connect with different mitzvot. So, for example, he quotes a Gemara about Rabbi Hanania ben Tradion, who wanted to know his status with regard to Olam Haba, and he's answered that, wait, you had no opportunities presented themselves to you that you could, really lean into a mitzvah. And so the idea here being that there's a variety of mitzvot, and hopefully over the course of their lifetime, every person has an opportunity to really connect with an individual mitzvah and do that the right way. So, for example, you might give tzedakah day in and day out, but one time someone knocks at your door, and that particular instance, you really welcome them the right way with a full heart. You give them as much as you can. According to the Rambam, that can have such an impact, a single experience of a mitzvah, that it changes who we are and has an impact on our soul. So to answer that question, I don't think necessarily, I do think the system of mitzvot has the aim and the ability to transform who we are and iron out all sorts of different areas of our life and our personality. And at the same time, due to how we are raised and various limitations in our lives, we have lots of mitzvot so that over the course of our lifetime, we can really connect with at least one, and God willing, hopefully many mitzvot that we can connect with and thereby develop as a human being.
So what you're telling me is both. Is that at one level, right, the fact that we're all committed to the same system of mitzvot is trying to, at least broadly speaking, bring all of us into a certain range of, let's say, acceptable behaviors, acceptable psychological states. Oh, I got you.
Yeah, I think the healthy personality is something that the Torah aims at, and it's designed to help iron out issues that we have in various areas of our lives, from Shabbos to Kashrus to Nida. I mean, these have an impact on who we are, and when people have issues, the Torah system is designed to help iron that out. Not the same thing as like a clinical sense where a person has something that needs to be treated by a licensed clinician in a hospital or clinic. That's not what we're talking about here.
Right, meaning just saying that we need to change in life is not saying that we're psychologically unwell.
Correct.
Everyone needs to change, and no one's perfect.
We're developmental human beings and developmental creatures, and as such, Torah is designed to aid and help with that development, and I do think the science of psychology can be helpful along that process.
Good. That's at one level. On the other level, you're saying, okay, but still, there's space for each person to use those tools and develop their own personality. So what I'm hearing here is that for you, despite the fact that Torah can shape our personalities, it doesn't expect us to conform to one particular religious model, even though we're doing all the same actions. Is that right?
Yes, I think mitzvot can have different experiences for different people. The Rambam seems to support that notion that in this life, again, maybe if we were all perfect creatures, then we'd all relate to the mitzvot in complete perfection. But the Rambam seems to indicate that, no, given the issues that various people are facing, if a person can connect with one mitzvah in their entire lifetime, that can have an impact. And that's his interpretation of the reason we have so many mitzvot, is that on average, on the whole, everyone will have an opportunity to connect with at least one mitzvah across their lifetime. It's an interesting theory, but that's what he's explaining.
Right, so let me push you a little bit farther. Is it just that people will have the opportunity to connect with different mitzvot? Or do you think that there could be two people who will have the same mitzvah that will resonate particularly with them, but in different ways, will shape their personalities in different but legitimate Torah ways? Is that possible?
Yes.
And if so, could you give me an example?
100%. I mean, I think I'll just stick with the tzedakah example. People have so many issues around money. And the fact that we have to give away of a portion of our money to someone that's not ourselves and not our family member and that doesn't benefit us directly, it's difficult to do sometimes. And as such, I think that can help change and adjust a person's unhealthy attitudes towards money. As King Solomon said, tzedakah tatzil mimavet, right? Tzedakah can save one from death. These are areas where a person can pour a lot of energy, and Torah can help straighten out those areas. And depending on the issue a person might have, that experience of tzedakah could have varied and yet incredibly impactful effect on two different individuals in different ways.
So like what? How would it express itself differently for different people? Like, Speak as a psychologist. Tell me, if you wanted to prescribe tzedakah as the behavioral therapy for two different people, how might it affect them? Like, give me two types of people that, without Torah, you would have said giving charity will shape you in different ways, and maybe that'll help us understand what the Torah is trying to do, but for different people.
Sure. I just want to be
But
clear,
put on your
too.
psychologist hat.
I'm going to push back on that. I'm going to put on my rabbi hat and explain it this way, because as a psychologist, we might more be talking about treatment. I'm not talking about anybody that has a clinical issue with this. I'm simply talking about various set points
Fine. Put
within
on your
the natural
pastoral hat. Put on your sterile hat, not your post-psych.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay,
But the natural personality, I could see someone that has a problem of spending too much money. They're spending money on left and right more than they would like to, more than they see it fit. The activity of giving tzedakah and using money for other things, I think, can help straighten out some of the conflicts the person can have in that area. At the same time, somebody who, for example, has trouble spending money, they save too much, they can't spend money when it's necessary. These are two, again, doesn't necessarily need a diagnosis, but people could struggle in either of those areas. And this is very much like the Rambam's explanation of sometimes going towards the middle path. I think the activity of giving tzedakah can help straighten out that area for a person and help them live a more balanced life and have a more balanced approach to money.
You could imagine that for one person, giving tzedakah, I'll start with your second one because that's easier to understand. If someone is stingy and needs to change that mentality around money, he doesn't spend, he doesn't use the money for proper things. So obviously, forcing him to give money to other people is going to change that and make him a more giving person. But your first possibility, which I think is interesting, is you're saying if someone is a spendthrift and doesn't think about what he spends money, forcing him to spend money on something meaningful might change his ability to think carefully before he spends in general.
Correct.
Right. So that's really interesting because what you're saying is the same mitzvah is affecting two people, but in completely different ways. So the same action is really channeling both of their personalities, but is perfecting them in opposite ways. So that's really interesting. So
I think that's part of the beauty of the Torah system, and that's why mitzvot are inherently beneficial activities that can help straighten out and benefit us in a variety of ways.
So, Rabbi Aaronson, we have discussed a lot, and you've given us a lot to think about. Let me ask you a question to make sure that this conversation continues. If you had one of the Migdal guys come to you and say, Rabbi Aaronson, I think the insights you're giving me into how psychology can help me think about myself, think about Torah, change the way I live Torah and learn Torah. Can you give me a book that will introduce me to psychology so I can begin that process? What book would you pick and why? You got 60 seconds.
The first one that comes to mind is a book called Freud by Jonathan Lear. And what's so interesting about Jonathan Lear's approach is that he really looks at Freud almost in a philosophical perspective. He focuses on this issue about how psychology helps a person to understand themselves, and then that provides the foundation to understanding the outside world. And so viewing Freud less in a clinical sense and more in a philosophical sense, I think has profound benefits, and I think it would benefit a yeshiva student who is considering big philosophical questions, considering what their driving forces are, how do they understand themselves, because that year that we spend, that many spend after high school as they transition to other areas of their life, is very foundational. And I think a primary area that a person should consider, of course, is developing all their Torah skills that they can during that year. And part of that time should and could be devoted to a degree of self-knowledge. And a book like this, for example, I think can help orient a person towards greater self-knowledge as they make big decisions about the rest of their life.
Okay, great. So we'll have to make sure we get a few copies for the Migdal shelf so people can start thinking about it. Ray Aaronson, this has been great. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Make sure to continue the conversation. Subscribe to our monthly podcast on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to reach out to us either at our website, migdalatorah.org, or at our email, podcast@migdalatorah.org. Looking forward to hearing from you and continuing the conversation.